Without further ado, we want to just again welcome you. So glad that you're here. And we will have another week. We'll talk about that afterwards next week to continue with our tour. And we'll go as far as we can, I guess, or that we don't get today. So we'll talk about that afterwards. So why don't we bow our heads together in prayer, and then Dave will come and lead us. Lord, again, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for evidence of your work in our lives, even with the ongoing weather. We know that you are here and in our midst, and we thank you for that, even on a cold day like tonight. But I thank you that we can be here in this place in the warmth of friends, and because your Spirit is here, and we can just tune in to the things that you want us to hear. And so we invite you here, Lord Jesus. We invite your Spirit to speak to us. We invite you to use Dave and his pictures and his insights and his teaching and the many, many things that you have put on his heart to share with us, to bring your land to life for us, and to help us just to understand more deeply your heart, your people, your word, and your love for each of us. And so tonight we just ask that you would lead us and that you would guide us. And we thank you for Jesus. And it's in his name that we pray. And everybody said with me, amen. Okay, here's Dave. Let's welcome Dave warmly.
So, you can hear me now? Okay, it's kind of like the commercial, the Ford commercial right now with the old Smokey and the Bandit song. We got a long ways to go and a short time to get there, so hold on tight. Brent always says on our tours that it's kind of like drinking from a fire hose, so I'll try and have a good aim. Okay, so I told you last time Monique and I were on the shore of the Galilee on the first morning there. We saw the cross and the clouds. And we went and got on a bus and left Tiberias and headed north. As we go north, we're basically there on the map. And you can see we were at Nazareth and went through Cana and come down to Tiberias right here. And now we're heading north. And we're going to come to Magdala, Capernaum, and Bethsaida. So this is a map of kind of what it looked like in the day of Christ. Josephus said there were 16 harbors there and 230 fishing boats that were working the Sea of Galilee all the time. We stayed at Ein Geb this year, which is, I got to get my fingers working here, is the red X there. So we're going across and up the other side of the sea right now, headed toward Magdala. You can see Magdala and then the Gennesaret Plain, then the Mount of Beatitudes, Capernaum, the Hula Valley, Bethsaida, and the northern Jordan River up above that. And that picture was taken from right about there. You can see Mount Arbel up in the upper part here. That's a significant landmark that we'll refer back to all the time. And this valley through here comes from Nazareth and Cana down. So that gives you labels on it: Magdala, Gennesaret Plain. Over here is the Golan Heights, Decapolis. Now that Decapolis means 10, Deca means 10, polis is like metropolitan, so it's 10 cities. And that's the Greco-Roman part of the Sea of Galilee. That's the non-Jewish place. So that's the only place they would have been raising hogs. And then Tiberias and Ein Geb, where we stayed 2 different times. As we come up toward Magdala, this is a picture I found that showed what it looked like 100, 150 years ago. In 2011, as we drove by, they had just started digging around there. And this is the ruins of Magdala. If you're like me, earlier in my life, I thought Mary Magdalene had the last name Magdalene, kind of like Jones or Smith. But that's not the case. It was Mary of Magdala. Now, whether she lived there or was just from there, we don't know, but she was probably a fairly wealthy woman that took care of our Messiah and ministered to him in many ways, including finances. This is the synagogue that they discovered when they first started to dig here. Some Catholic folks were going to put in a ladies' retreat, and they started to dig, and they were very disappointed to find that the archaeologist who went in ahead of them hit some stone that caused them to dig, and they were later excited to find out this was a synagogue from the time of Christ. And this is what it looks like today, what it looked like last fall when we were there. Under that big wooden canopy is where the synagogue is located. And when you look at the synagogue, you see seating all the way around it, kind of like we saw in Nazareth last week. Outside of that, it's kind of a walking area that's all mosaic tile. The entry was right here. Over here was a storage where they kept the Torah scrolls, that kind of thing. But especially, you see this artifact here. That's right where they found it. And they believe that may have been a table for reading the Torah scrolls, where they bring them out, roll them out, and read the scriptures each week in their services. Synagogues are kind of like community centers too, so they were used all the time. One of the features on this thing was a menorah and a couple oil jars. Some think that this has depictions of the Holy Temple and all of the carvings around it. Especially cool is the menorah, though. The menorah has the shape of kind of like a tree. It has almonds, and it uses olive oil for its light, so it has representation of a tree, represents Christ in that it's like the tree of light and the tree of life. And the center shaft they call the shamash, or the servant, and that would be the servant candle also, but that represents Christ. And then there's 3 branches off each side, so you've got 6 branches off of the support of the servant. So it's like 6 is the number of man, so the branches represent us. And at one time in the New Testament, Christ said, "I'm the light of the world." And another time he said, "You're the light of the world." So how could it be that he was talking about both? Well, he was comparing that to the menorah, where all the lights together formed the number 7, which is the number of completeness. Anyway, that's what the synagogue looked like. And when we go outside of that area, Magdala was a fish drying, fish processing area that supplied fish for travelers clear up into Europe. And out on the shoreline, when in the 1980s, a couple of guys were out there when the water was low, kind of like it was last fall. And at that time, they discovered what looked like a little wood protruding out of the bottom of the seabed there. And they started digging on it, and within 11 days, they were able to dig up a boat that this is a model of. They, as they dug, they could only use their fingers because the wood was so spongy and tender that they had to dig by hand, and as they exposed areas of wood, they would blow great stuff like what we use for insulating foam, urethane foam on the thing. They filled up the interior of it and then went to the outside and surrounded the outside and totally encased it in this foam. And then they dug a trench out to the sea and got this thing out on the water, and it made its first voyage in 2,000 years. Went to an area where they restored it. They kept it underwater with some kind of solution in it that hardened the wood, and today it is in a museum there right near Magdala, and they call it the Jesus boat. That boat holds 12 passengers and 1 oarsman, I've read in 2 different sources. So I assume the oarsman was a guy on the rudder, because I think they would all have been rowing. And they also had a little sail on it. Anyway, after that we get on a boat, and these are a little bit out of sequence from how we went on our tour last fall, but it seems most convenient for this presentation. We went on a boat that's a boat ride on the Galilee. And there's one man there that has 3 boats, I think. This is one of them. He's a Messianic believer. His name's Daniel. Daniel is in the back over here. That's Daniel. He plays and sings, and we get on the Sea of Galilee and get to sing praise and worship songs in Hebrew and English. And I've been on the boat on the Galilee 3 times and have never been able to not tear up. It always makes me cry. Sue is up on the front of the deck there. There is Mount Arbel over here, and there's that valley coming down, Magdala over in here. But this area off to this side would be Capernaum. Here's the plain of Gennesaret. This may well be the place where Jesus walked on the water, right under where she's standing. Somewhere in that general area for sure. And Daniel always flies the U.S. and Israeli flag together when we go on the boat, and I pray that it'll always be that way. We're told that those that bless Israel are blessed, and I pray our nation will be wise enough to continue to do that. As we come back into the shore, this little dock right here, last fall when we looked at it, I had a picture that I lost when my camera left me, but about 8 or 10 feet down is the bed of the sea right there. This thing was dry to there, and clear out to here was all dry ground. So that gives you an idea how much water has been lost in this last drought. In fact, as you go out the dock, they had a boat parked right at the end of the dock, so you had to go out and use the boat as an additional dock to get to where the boats were, because of the water was so shallow there, so they didn't beach. As we look off to the north, we see Capernaum and the Mount of Beatitudes up in here. Looking back toward the west, we see that Mount Arbel up here and the valley that comes down from Nazareth and Cana. This is the Gennesaret Plain. When you hear about Gennesaret, that's the area it is. It's a lush, wonderful growing area. This is Migdal, which is the modern village or town of Migdal, which is Magdala. And Magdala is right down here. So as we leave that area, we go up into the hills around there, and they're volcanic hills, and there's basalt boulders everywhere. I mean, you can't imagine how many rocks are covering the ground there. But at the same time, over time, if they just roll the rocks off and bulldoze them off, or however they get them, pile up the rocks and plant crops, and it's lush growing soil for volcanic soil. I think they call it alluvial soil, but anyway, as we go up to the top of the Mount of Beatitudes, we come to this view and to the gate entering into that Catholic church and yard there that's next to where they think may have been the place where Christ did the Sermon on the Mount. When we look from the parking lot down to the sea, we see Capernaum off over to the left. This is the monastery that was built in that place, and it's a beautiful churchyard. Just past that is a natural amphitheater, a bowl-shaped valley through there that in 2011, that's what it looked like. There's a kind of a platform here and here. You can see it in each of these. And they think that may have been where Christ would have delivered the Sermon on the Mount. There are maybe 1 or 2 other places where this might have been, but this fits very well. Brent said that place, he and a friend stood at the top, and also the other guy down kind of at the bottom down here, and could speak and hear each other naturally without having to, shout too loud or anything. So when we're here, we're reminded to look at all these banana plants. This is a banana plantation. Look at all these banana plants and imagine each one of them as a person. When Christ was giving the Sermon on the Mount, you could have had and probably did have a crowd that big listening to him. This time when we were there last fall, they had bird nets over all of it, which it amazes me. Everywhere in Israel, they have these areas that are vast areas that they've covered with netting and greenhouses, things like that are just amazing how much effort they put into production of food and how valuable they are, how much they value it to protect it. We passed through the yard and back to the parking lot and head back down the hill, and now we are going to the area of Capernaum. Capernaum was the town that Christ chose to use as his main base of operation in the Galilee. This is an aerial view I found of it. So we came in right here. That picture was taken. This is the entryway to it. There's a synagogue here. There's some residential ruins here and here, and then this octagonal spaceship-looking kind of church, this modern church, that's built over the place that they believe was Peter's house, at least his mother-in-law's house, or however that works. This area, they found a milestone there, part of the Via Maris, and the Via Maris is, showed you a picture last week, that was a superhighway that went along the sea for up and down between Egypt, Europe, and the Far East, and out into the Fertile Crescent, and then on spice roads on toward China. So this was a main thoroughfare through the populated areas, and this rest of it's all desert. So the natural path was right close to the sea. When we look in the yard out here, we see these stone jars that remind us of when Jesus turned the water into wine at the wedding in Cana. It said that the stone jars held 2 to 3 firkins apiece. That's 18 to 27 gallons of water. And so he turned a lot of water into wine. This column is also there, was part of the synagogue, ruins of the synagogue. And they say it has significance because the menorah that's carved into it has 3 legs. Some think that may have been a Christian symbolism, that the 3-in-1 God may have had symbolism in that menorah. This is some of the beautiful carved cornice work around the top of the building they found and placed in the display, with all kinds of geometric designs. Maybe proof that the Star of David was used in those days, we don't know. But anyway, it's amazing how much these people carved stone and used it for all types of vessels. This column was found there. It says Alphaeus, the son of Zebediah, which is Zebedee. And Alphaeus, I think Matthew was called Levi, the son of Alphaeus, and the 2 brothers were the sons of Zebedee. And so this is probably in a synagogue that was built in the 5th century, so 400 or 500 years, they still had the family names around there of the disciples. So that may or may not have directly relationship. This is an overview of that area, the synagogue being the worship area here. This is kind of like a community center where you'd have the wedding receptions, that kind of thing. The main street of town here. This area, Rami told us this might even be one home or one family's homes in there. When you hear of the parables and Christ talking about the man going off to build a room for his wife and then coming back, so they added to the family homes, and extended families lived together, and that may have been 1 or 2 homes. Then the octagonal part of that area, in the 5th century on, the churches were built, and chapels were often built with 8 sides to them, representing the number of completeness and new beginnings, or not completeness, but the number of new beginnings in the Christian church symbolism of the time in the Byzantine area, or era. This is what the synagogue looked like, an artist's rendering of it. And this is a view inside the synagogue. These columns would have supported a balcony, and you would have had balconies on both sides, and then notice the seating on the sides where people would sit on each side, just like in Nazareth. And you kind of sit in a circle or around the edges of the room and talked across to each other in your worship. Another shot to the north, and there was an upper story on this part, and there's a door to the upper story. Very significant. That white stone was hauled in from somewhere else, and that was built in a synagogue that was built maybe 400 or 500 years after the time of Christ. But it was built right over a pre-existing synagogue. It's this black basalt rock, and this synagogue was probably the one that Christ taught in, healed and did all the different things in Capernaum. You look out the door and you can see a little bit of the modern church building down there. This is outside, showing the foundations and the walls of the former first century synagogue. This is the area of the homes in the circle there, and this is some of the archaeology of the area. Once again, when these things were torn down, people would push everything over until it filled off level. And that usually left 2 or 3 feet of the bottom of the structure in place, buried with level ground of all the rubble. So when they dig this stuff up, they always find the bottom part of the walls and usually the floor structures. And notice that they had all kinds of stone vessels and those kind of things. As we come down a little farther, we go in under this modern church in this B area, and this is the area that they believe to be Peter's house because of the fact that over the centuries, one chapel after another is built over it. So starting from the bottom and working up, you can see the different foundation archaeology remains that they have found. So that bottom one was the first century, probably the time of Christ. Then 400 years later, the gold one in the second from the bottom, and then the Byzantine and the more modern churches that were built over it. This is an interior wall right here of the first chapel that was built around what they think was Peter's house. The building up above it has a glass floor in it. It's a Catholic church of some sort. You can go up in that thing and look down through the floor and see all that from above. You go out along the shoreline here, and this just thrills me. This is the place where Peter and the disciples all fished from. This is the place where they would come with the Messiah as they traveled back and forth across the lake to different locations. And right about there, where that boat is, which is about where Sue was standing on the boat, that may be very well the place, or close to it, where Jesus calmed the storm, where he walked on water and all those kind of things. And it just thrills me to see these things that are physically real. And read a thing today, a guy was talking about the archaeology and the location of all the land of Israel, and he called it the fifth gospel. The whole thing is just reinforces the Bible in every way. Now, if you're in a boat out here where that boat was, that valley, the winds would come off the Mediterranean. They'd pick up speed and they would come in and blow across here at great speeds, and storms would just suddenly appear, kind of like the duck boat incident we had last fall. That out of nowhere, that storm came in and sunk that duck boat. Well, this is the same kind of thing that happens in the Galilee. And so where Jesus calmed the storm, it was probably a storm that blew in out of here from nowhere. Also, another interesting thing is that the boat that the disciples were in and working against the wind and all that kind of thing, that they were trying to labor all night and couldn't get anywhere when Jesus came walking by. That indicates that they were trying to go into the wind, because those boats had a sail on them. So they were trying to go into the wind or into the storm, and so that's the reason they were rowing without a sail. Not a significant thing, but it's kind of interesting. If you look off, just over here was Mount Arbel and all that, where that arrow was. Right over here is the location at Tagba, which is the chapel that has the famous mosaic floor with the fish and the basket of bread. And that's the place that Kathy Lee Crosby referred to in her rabbi film. They say that area has a lot of warm water springs in it. Rami's map, he shows us, is the location of the authority around the lake, around the Sea of Galilee. This is the shape of the Galilee. Kinneret means harp-shaped, and so that's a harp-shaped lake. Everything on this side of the lake, clear down, is that half of the property is all controlled by King Herod. That's Herod Antipas. So Antipas is the brother who inherited from Herod the Great, and he inherited this portion of Herod the Great's kingdom. This part is Herod Philip and his inheritance with the Golan Heights and up to the north, and we'll see some more of that in a minute. But so when you read that they're a tetrarchy, that means a quarter, I think. So Philad's tetrarchy was up in here. This part, from here down and off into quite a bit of outlying area, was the area of Decapolis. That was a Gentile area, and that's where the only place where there would have been hogs being raised. So when the demoniac when came to Jesus on the shore, the man living in the tombs, then Jesus drove the legion of demons out of his body and into 2,000 hogs, and that's the area that the hogs would have ran down into the sea. As we leave Capernaum, we start to head north, and we're heading up what's called the Hula Valley. Now this valley at one time, during Mark Twain's trip down through there, was one of the valleys that had all the malaria and mosquitoes and swamps in it. It's now been dried out by the Jewish settlers in that area for a number of years, and they have turned it into lush cropland. As you travel, and we're traveling along the line of that yellow line there, we come up to an area called Tel Dan, which is the ruins of the city of Dan. Tel Dan was the Israelite tribe of Dan who had conquered the people of this area and moved in after they had already had their inheritance in another part of Israel. Anyway, they came up here, they thought this looked pretty good, so they thought they needed more room and conquered the people here, and from a very early time they had this area called Dan. And in the Bible, when you read about something from Dan to Beersheba, Dan is kind of the farthest parts north, and Beersheba is kind of to the south. So this is also the place where, and this is the entry gates to that area. And when you read in the Bible about people in the gates, that's kind of like the courthouse square in the little towns. The gates would have been the place where they held court, where the officials and the kings and all those kind of things would have been. And it's a main spring supply for the Jordan River. It's amazing that this area, what does it say, 250 million cubic gallons of water come out of that thing every year. And that spring would equal 63.6 trillion gallons yearly. So it's an enormous amount of water that comes from the snow melt on the top of Mount Hermon and then goes into the rock fissures and that kind of thing in the mountain, and then comes out at the bottom at this river and a couple of others. So that's the Tel Dan River there. This is also one of the two places that Jeroboam, who was, I'll start, King Solomon had the whole kingdom. When he died, his son Rehoboam inherited the kingdom of Israel. And Rehoboam was requested to ease their tax burden of the people, because Solomon really levied heavy taxes. Rehoboam said no. He checked with his advisors, and his young advisor said, go ahead and put it to him. So he said, you think my dad's little finger was on you? He said, I'm going to set on you. with taxes. So the 10 tribes of the north decided they weren't going to put up with that stuff. They rebelled and started their own country of Israel to the north. So Rehoboam has Judah in the south, and the country of Israel to the north was the country of Israel, and it was called Ephraim a lot of times because Ephraim was the firstborn son of authority in that area and all that. Anyway, Jeroboam was the king of that area. He decided that if his people went back to worship at Jerusalem, once they had split, that they were going to have a problem with reintroducing and intermingling with their cousins back in Judah. So he set up new worship centers and changed the time of the worship and put up golden calves in 2 places in the northern part of Israel. The first one was at Bethel down near Jerusalem, not far from Shiloh, where we'll see, and the other one was up here at Dan. This is the sacred precinct where the worship was done of the golden calf, and this is some of the ruins of it. If you look at this thing, that metal structure is in the outline of the pagan altar that would have been there. And this would have been their water supply, their holy laver, kind of like the brazen laver that was at the true temple of God. And this is another shot of that area. So for a number of years, the children of Israel, of the northern tribes, intermingled true worship of God with pagan idolatry. And this is one of their main worship centers here. It was also a place in 67, I think, that Syria was going to attack Israel from the north. And this area, everything on this side of that gravel road was Syria, and this was Israel's to the south. Israel had lookout posts and entrenchments and all that kind of thing, and there was a huge battle there at Tel Dan. And this is some of the trenches and that kind of thing in that area. A bulldozer that was probably used to make tank entrenchments and tank battlements for that area. And that's the border line. That over here is Lebanon. This way was Syria. Lebanon gave this ground to Syria, so because they weren't going to get into the battle, but they wanted to give Syria the capability to travel on their own ground to attack Israel. And had they have won, they would have within a day or two come to Jerusalem and conquered that whole land of Israel. But the Israelis prevailed through some pretty miraculous things, and that's where that battle was. This little community was given they were Lebanese, they were given to Syria. When Israel won the war, these guys said, well, they'd rather be under Israeli rule because they didn't think that they would get as good a deal from Syria. So that, I'm not sure if it's still that way, but I think that's an Israeli jurisdiction. That's some of the tank banks that were the hidey holes for the tanks. I don't know what you call that, but the Syrian tanks there in the area. You come around the corner, then we leave that place and we come around the corner and we come to this. And this is a wood or a mud brick Canaanite city gate. It's 3 gates deep, one inside the other. You can't really see it in there, but they've got this canopy over it so that rains do not destroy the mud brick in that area to preserve it. But this is the place where in Genesis, Abraham was, after the Sodom and Gomorrah and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and all that were attacked by 4 kings from the east, and Lot and all the people of Sodom and Gomorrah were captured and taken off to the north, and they were taking them back as captives. And Abraham mustered 350 some men in his employ, and they all got together and they went up and set Lot and the gang free. And so it says that he chased them to Dan. And when he caught up with them in Dan, then they had battles up toward Damascus, which isn't far from here. But they think this gate was probably here and seen by Abraham in his day, 3,500 years ago or so. As we travel away from that place, we pass down the highway, we see these signs all the time, says danger mines. And so, these are old minefields from all the different battles of different times. And as we travel along, we see that they're cow pastures. And we're told by Rami and the guys that the the cows are the mine sweepers. Every once in a while you'll have a cow step on a mine and you've got unkosher beef. But anyway, so that's the mine sweepers on the way up to a place called in Philip's part of the land. And this is Herod Philippi. I'm going to kind of read this because I want to get it all straight, but at times on these trips, the Spirit of God puts things into our head and our heart, puts two and two together, and a lot of times the sum is a lot more than 4. It's more like 4 to the multiplied power. So when we were in Caesarea last fall, the Lord gave me a bit of an epiphany as I was reading a sign at the Temple of Pan. After Herod the Great died, his son Philip inherited this quarter of the kingdom of the Golan Heights. And Caesarea Philippi was a city that was built by Herod that had under another name, Herod the Great. And when Philip inherited it, he renamed the city after his false god and king, Caesarea, Caesar of Rome, which he called Caesarea Philippi. Then it was built near a river that was just like the Dan River and the Dan Springs. It was another one of the headwaters for the Jordan River. It springs out of a cave at the base of a cliff. That solid rock cliff is enormous, you can see, and it goes way on past that, and it's part of the rock of the Hermon Mountain. It would have dwarfed the Roman-style temples at the base of it. In that place, a hideous god named Pan was worshipped. Now, Pan was a flute playing, half goat, half man. He was a pagan false god of shepherds, and we get the word panic from legends of the people that had fear of the night sounds of Pan. The temple was built in front of the cave at the mouth where the sacrifices were made, and a sign at the side essentially said each year they sacrificed an innocent victim to the god Pan to ensure increase in good life for the people and their crops and livestock. The victim was taken into the temple cave and thrown into a pit at the back of the cave. This is that cave today. It's been filled in over the years, over the last thousands of years. And if that sacrifice went down into the pit and disappeared, that meant that the sacrifice was accepted and abundant life was guaranteed was the promise for the next growing season and year. If, however, blood showed up coming out from under that temple, the sacrifice was rejected. Now, Jesus knew all this. He and his disciples grew up around there. They lived just 10, 20, 30 miles from there most of their life. And he would have been familiar with all of this. As Yeshua talked with his disciples one day in that area, he used the culture, the geography, and the false religion of that place to predict in great detail his sacrifice for our salvation in advance, in prophetic advance. And I expect that perspective was the bearing on Matthew when he recorded in Matthew 16, 13 to 20. When Jesus came into the coast of Caesarea Philippi, He said, who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter answered and said, you're Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus said, blessed are you, Simon, for flesh and blood hasn't revealed that to you, but my Father, which is in heaven. And I say also to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it, and I will give unto you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. You see, Christ's kingdom was not built on a rock cliff with a pit to the gates of hell at its base. But the true rock of his church was a foundational fact that Christ is the true Son of the living God. Now I realized at that moment, standing in front of that sign by the grotto of Pan, how amazing our God is. Christ was actually tipping his hand on a plan that was made from before the foundations of the earth to storm the gates of hell with his cross. He was showing his role as a new and better sacrifice, even for the pagans. In that few short words, he was telling his exact opposition and power over satanic false worship. You see, their God was a manifestation of Satan. He was half goat and half man. Our God is the good shepherd. Pan was supposed to be half goat and half man. Christ was the Lamb of God and was all God and all man. Their God had to have a different sacrifice offered for him each time. Christ died for us and gave himself a sacrifice once for all so that we could have eternal life. Pan's sacrifice had to die. Christ sacrificed himself and yet lived. Pan's victim went into a cave and then died. Christ went into a cave and lived and rose alive. If Pan's victim came out of the pit, sacrifice was rejected, Christ rose out of the grave and proved his sacrifice for us was accepted. If blood and water came flowing out of the temple of Pan, that showed rejection. Blood and water flowing out of Christ on the cross, the very temple of the true and living God, gave us eternal acceptance. Pan keeps the gates of hell. Christ gives us the keys to the kingdom of heaven. I'm not sure there are even more parallel, I'm sure that there are even more parallel opposites in this story than I'm aware of, and maybe in days ahead the Father will show us more of these things. I'm sure there are other places in the Bible that do just that. Regardless, it's awesome that our God, from even before the foundation of the earth, pre-planned and aligned things and people to convey such messages of his power and his love throughout his creation. Like the Bible says, all creation declares the glory of God, even his enemies and their self-willed rebellion. It gives added dimension to the promise in Philippians that every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. As we leave that area, I passed a little t-shirt shop. It said, don't worry, America, Israel is behind us. I pray that's true because over and over in these battles over the years, Israel has come out the victor because God has had their back. As we travel on down the valley headed south, we pass a lot of these type of little places, installations. Rami calls chocolate factories. They're basically armories that are scattered throughout Israel. Virtually every citizen in Israel, not all of them, but most, have served in the service or are presently in the service. So anytime there's a threat, they have places to go to immediately arm themselves and defend their country and their families. As we travel on, we see tanks that are in their maneuvering fields and their practice areas, whatever. And as we get a little closer to a mountain, that's called Mount Bental, we pass an area, it's called the Valley of Tears, that in 1973 was a 4-day tank war. The Arabs were going to push Israel into the sea. They attacked on Yom Kippur, which is the day that everything is shut down in Israel for the holiday, even the radio stations and the TV stations. So they thought they had them surprised and at their hand. And there were about 2,000 Syrian tanks attacking an area where Israel had about 170. And after 4 days of fighting, Israel was down to 7 or 8 tanks from different units. They weren't even from the same bunch, so they didn't have even good communications between each other. And there was a hero named Kalani. He'd been burned over 60% of his body in the 1967 wars down in Egypt, and had lied about his health, changed his documents so that he could go back into the army in an active duty, and he wound up on a tank in this battle. And he decided that it was all they could do is just shoot their last bullets and die defending the place. So he called on his radio to tell all the other guys out there to follow him, and he charged right into the fray. He popped over a hill and immediately, miraculously, shot 2 enemy tanks, spun around and saw a third, and was in the gun sights of that guy. Fortunately, one of the other tanks had paid enough attention and decided to follow him later, and they came over the hill and shot that tank right before they blew Kalani's tank up. At that point, all the Syrians turned around and left. To this day, there's disputes over how and why they gave up, because they were just 5 or 6 or 7 tanks away from 2 or 3 hour drive straight to Jerusalem and conquering the whole country of Israel. So we're up on this mountain that is today, it's called Mount Bental. It's a volcanic mound, an outlook post, and today it's a national park that overlooks the Valley of Tears and the rest of those regions. And this is the view from that area. This whole valley, this whole plain in here has a band of UN-controlled ground that's a no-fire zone, and so that's one reason we can get so close to that in this tour. So we go up in there and walk around the place and see all these foxholes and entrenchments and gun placements and all these kind of things. And Carol and I, and out in the center is this courtyard with a kind of a road sign, so to speak, showing the distance from this place to all the hot spots of the Middle East. It's only, about 450 miles or 500 miles from Baghdad, less than 40 to Damascus. You can almost see Damascus when you look out the plain, and distances like that for all this stuff. I can't read all the little signs there. So when we look out across there, Damascus is in the haze just beyond naked eye view. I'm sure with good binoculars or equipment you could see Damascus easily. This is Mount Hermon up there, and over in here is where Tel Dan and all that stuff was. So we're walking around and going through the trenches, and then you can dive down into areas that are bunkers and tunnels underneath, and you come into this thing. And this is a kind of a pillbox. It's a little bit bigger than a septic tank, but it's only about 8 by 12, something like that. And this is the viewing window out the front of it. Underneath here was a wooden bench where you could stand up and look out the window, and in 2011, Carol and I were down in there, and we were looking out across the plain, and all of a sudden we heard people that had come down that tiny little tight tunnel and were hanging around at the door, and I'm thinking, man, we're trapped in here. We can't really get out. Not really, but we turned around though, and these folks were the ones that were blocking our way. That's Stephen Curtis Chapman and his wife and his daughter and son-in-law, and a guy named Jeff Moore, who's a famous Christian artist. and they're good friends. And so they were taking pictures of each other, and so Carol offered to take a picture of them and then got one for herself, and she loaned me that. So that was pretty exciting. Later we got to hear Stephen Curtis Chapman on a concert down at the Temple Mount. As we head out of there, we come to Decapolis. We're heading south, and as we come to Decapolis, this gives you an idea of one of the 10 cities that was in that area. They were big metropolitan areas. This is a shot of Bet Shean, and that picture only covers about half or a third of the archaeology that's there. It's an enormous ruins. And we come by this place, though, and it's a steep place that has caves, and this area right here has a cave and ruins of a little chapel that they believe may have been the place where the pigs ran into the sea. So it's called Kersey today, which, you know, kind of sounds like Gurgasa. These, as names change from one language to another, they get a little bit different, but they kind of usually sound the same or have some relationship. The 3 different arrows there show 3 different caves in the area, and the top one is a view from a cave down toward the Sea of Galilee. And that Sea of Galilee is much lower in that picture than it would have been at the time of Christ, so that cliff would have been closer to the shoreline. We go on down, and we're leaving the Sea of Galilee. We pass over a bridge, and this area, the bridge would be up here. This area is a baptismal site that was encouraged and put in place by a man named Jack Graham, who's a pretty famous pastor and preacher on TV today. But they got a bunch of Christian donations together and built this baptismal site. It's called Yardenette. And in 2011, we had our baptisms there. This is the Jordan River as it looked at that time on down the way. As we go on down the Jordan River Valley, we're headed now toward the Dead Sea. And we travel a few miles and we come to Bet Shean. Bet Shean is, this is a model of that town. It was, you know, they had their racetracks and the amphitheater and their bathhouses, and it was a major metropolitan area. And there were probably 15 of those that were within 40 miles of Christ's hometown and his area and his life. So he was no stranger to metropolitan, pretty modern cities for the day. This is the theater that's there, and this is an interesting feature that's at the theater. And I had some friends that demonstrated the use. We talked about it a little bit, and we decided these things should have been scrolls. And I can imagine, you know, kind of one guy's reading the racing forums there, and the next guy's looking at the theater section, and then probably have the Gladiator Times in one of them. So also they had a huge community center, basically. Their bathhouses, people would go to, kind of like going to the golf course today to close a business deal. People would go to the bathhouses there, and this is kind of a drawing of what that looks like. And this is the main street of Bet Shean, or one of them. And imagine this is kind of the street where the chariots went down. This supported a roof over a raised sidewalk, and then the shops would be in behind it. And then this was the Acropolis of the area, and that's the main thing I'm headed toward to show you. Tai Chi was in one of the floors. That's their god of that city. Every city and every location had pagan gods and goddesses in their deal. And thought I had a different picture of that. Anyway, at the top of that Acropolis, you find the ruins of an Egyptian governor's house from long before the time of the Israelites in that land. And the main thing I wanted to show you was the correlation. This is the Jezreel Valley. Bet Shean's near the Jordan River, and you can see how flat and broad it is. This is the Armageddon area, you know, where the armies are going to muster or battle or whatever. And it goes all the way back to the Mediterranean, 20 or 30 miles down the way, and all the way to the Jordan River and then up and out. So it was a major trade route and important place to have military outposts. As we go down the Jordan River Valley, we start, now this is in June. We start seeing really dried, desolate looking areas. And sometimes in the middle of the winter, you have some green grass grow there. But this is about what it looked like everywhere to Mark Twain when he came through and what he probably saw. And as we go on down the Jordan River and look off to the right, there's mountains to the right, and that's the wilderness of Judea and Samaria, where Christ probably spent his 40 days in fasting. We come on down, and there's some Palestinian settlements along the way and that kind of thing. Not sure, it always seems like the windows are out of them, so I don't know if people live in them and just don't have air conditioning or anything like that, or if it's actually empty from the different times of war. Everywhere you see, every so often you'll see one of these, and it's a Bedouin camp, and they'll be herding their sheep and all that kind of thing, and it's amazing that they're temporary dwellings, if you can call them that. The tents you see that are black are made of goat hair, and the goat hair is similar, I think, to the goat hair that covers the Holy Tabernacle. And the goat hair is made, is woven, but it also is extremely porous where you can see light filter through from the sun, so it serves kind of as a screen, but in rainy times the hair will swell up and make a watertight surface. So I never could figure out why people lived in black tents in the desert, but that must be the reason. One place we drove by had a Mercedes and a satellite dish out in front of it. This is a Bedouin person, probably a woman, herding their goats and sheep. You can see all the lush fodder for them there. And you start seeing more camels and that kind of thing. But also in this area, you see crops that are being irrigated and grown on both sides of the river, on the Jordanian side as well as the Israeli side. Well, the story is that the Israelis have made a treaty with the Jordanians and have been teaching them how to irrigate and helping them with the growing of their food and that kind of thing in the Jordan River Valley. So that's pretty cool. At the same time, they use a lot of plastic to cover. I guess that's probably covering the roots to keep the moisture in around the roots of the plant. But sometimes it's like a little tunnel greenhouse that runs a whole row of the plant rows. I assume that's also to keep moisture in, where around here we keep the heat in. They're trying to keep heat out and moisture in, I'm sure. But the amazing thing is the Palestinians at the end of the season, they'll just plow it all in. They plow, you see open fields with just chunks of plastic everywhere in them. And this is some of their greenhouses down in there, same kind of principle. And also, this is one of the dairy installations that's down there. They've got dairy confinements and produce a tremendous amount of milk. They milk their sheep, and the sheep have, they've developed breeds that have 10 times the amount of milk production they used to have and that kind of thing. But their dairy installations, they produce more per cow in Israel by 2 to 5% than anywhere in the United States does. And we have pretty high-tech dairy farms. So it truly is a land that's once again becoming a land of milk and honey. Here we are passing, I think, Jericho, and we're heading down to the Dead Sea now. And notice that the Dead Sea was called the Sea of Asphaltus in the time of the Romans. There is crude oil around there. Dried crude oil becomes asphalt. There are different times in the Dead Sea where chunks of asphalt will float up as big as a car and float around on the Dead Sea. I saw a picture one time of a man sitting on top of a chunk of asphalt. So the Romans called it the Lake of Asphaltus. And that is also the theory that maybe the Sodom and Gomorrah folks were wealthy because they were oil rich, selling oil for their mortar to build mud brick things and also for light and burning in oils and all those kind of things. So they had so much oil that they didn't have to work very hard, and that may be why they became a decadent population. We get down to the far end of the Dead Sea, and there's these resorts in the middle of nowhere. And they have a beach out there. That's where we stayed last fall. It's a beautiful resort, a luxurious hotel. You walk down the way, quarter of a mile, you come to this beach, and that's the Dead Sea, folks. You can't sink in it. They say the water is over 35% salt, plus additional minerals to the point where that's the richest mineral deposit in the earth. And so as we look out across there, also this area is a lower part of the Dead Sea, and this is the upper part. So today it's getting so low that they have to pump in the northern part of the sea, and they have to pump it down a channel toward the southern end for their mining purposes. They have drying beds for minerals and all that kind of thing, and also to keep that resort open, that Ein Bokek, I think's the name of it. You look around here and everything's burnt. It's just fried. It's amazing, that whole valley, and it's been that way for 3,500 years since the time of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. This shows that lower part of the Dead Sea, and this is a picture of the channel where it's feeding from the lower to the upper sea via pumps. And this guy is doing something that's highly unadvisable. He's down along the shoreline of the Dead Sea because as the sea goes lower and lower and it loses water, all the subsoil and the salt impregnated ground under it dissolves and goes away anywhere where there's fresh water comes into the area. And this is a typical example of that. This green grass shows that they've got a freshwater spring here. That's the only way that grass could grow. And then as it goes down, it enters into the Dead Sea, but as it travels underground and passes through, it creates caverns that then sink in as sinkholes. And that's a view of the same thing. It's a beautiful view. Over here's the Moab Mountains on the other side, and here. And these Moab Mountains were named after Moab, who was the son of Lot and his daughter. I'll talk about that a little bit more, but you can see how close Moab is. And of course, this was all underwater at one time. That's how much the sea has receded. You drive along and you see this structure along the highway. This is a seaport for the Dead Sea. At one time, they shipped back and forth across there, and that thing is way up out of the ground. It's right alongside of the highway. When you look from there down to the Dead Sea, that's your view if you were standing close to that seaport on the road. That's how far the water's receded in the Dead Sea. And probably somewhere along that color change line over there is where it used to be on that side, which is hard to tell at that distance. Moab Mountains again, and the Ammonites lived over there. As you look out the other side of the bus, just down the road a ways, you see these lines on a cliff there. And these lines, these two big black lines hide a little tiny line here. It says PEF. That was a Palestinian Exploration Fund organization from the 1850s. That's where the water level of the Dead Sea was at that time. So it's dropped that much. And when you look from there out your window on the bus, it's eye level with you as you're sitting in the bus window. And you look the other way, and somewhere down there is the edge of the water. So it gives you an idea how much the Dead Sea is really receding. As we go on down, we pass Qumran. Qumran is an amazing place. It's where the same year that Israel became a nation, God chose to expose the Dead Sea Scrolls as over and over. We see archaeology popping up to support the truth of the Bible. And as we're totally being restored as we go along, it's just amazing. And the timings on these things are perfect. So those jars kind of represent the looks of what the scrolls were kept in. A clay jar, kind of like our geranium pots. And this is the cave that the first scrolls were found in. A little Bedouin guy had goats and sheep out in here, and one of the goats went down in this cave. And he didn't want to go in, so he just threw some rocks in to try and scare it out. When he did, the rocks he heard breaking pottery, went down to investigate, and then they found it. Since then, I think they found 11 caves with scrolls and fragments in them, and I think they may find more before long. And this is looking from there down to the Dead Sea. So Qumran probably was, the shoreline was probably up in here somewhere. You can see the highway right there. It was clear up in here, so it was probably close to the shoreline at the time it was inhabited. Greg will remember this, or close to it. This may be hooked to the Kidron Valley between the Mount of Olives and the Temple Mount. Now, in the wintertime and in the rainy seasons of the year, they'll have gutter washer type of rainstorms to the point where they have so much rain that it just comes down in flash floods, kind of like we would have in Texas or Arizona. And when Greg and Brent, I think in 2010, was it? They went down toward Qumran and Masada and down in there. There was a rainstorm up in Jerusalem, washed this road out, and they had to drive way out and around to the south to get back to Jerusalem. So that is a wadi that communicates with the Temple Mount area, and it may be a secret way out for people when they had armies surrounding them, that kind of thing. They may have been able to sneak some things out through that area, which is very near Qumran. Then we come down a little farther, we come to Ein Gedi. That's a place where David and his 400 soldiers hid out in a cave. The cave is pretty much the ceiling is dropped in on it, but that was a huge cave at one time. And they were hiding back in there, and Saul and his army were trying to find him. Saul went into the cave for relief, and while he was in there, David snuck down and cut a piece off of his garment. Saul went back out. David, a little bit later, showed up on a hilltop showing him his tassels or whatever he'd cut off, and proving to Saul that he could have killed him, but he honored his God's anointed. Then also at that little park there, you have these trees. These things are called acacia trees, or in the Bible, shittim trees, and that's the wood that the Ark of the Covenant and the table of showbread and all the temple furniture was made out of. So they also call it eternal wood because it's such tough stuff, and the trees grow in extreme conditions. Palm trees are kind of considered the same way because they'll grow in such dry places. And this just shows you how burned up and desolate the whole place is. It looks like it's been just burned to a crisp. All the rocks around here, as you're traveling along, it's just amazing. And this is the whole valley of the Dead Sea, the whole valley of Siddim, I'm sure it was called in the Old Testament, the valley of Sodom. And we come down to a place very near Masada. Now I'm going to pass these things around, and if you would not take the lid off, these are brimstone that came from this area. There's little pieces of ash. There's one little piece that's got a burned mark on it and a little discoloration on one of the balls. If you just hold it upright, because they're not glued in or anything. But that's brimstone, that's sulfur. It burns about 5,000 degrees or more, and it will burn up just about anything, even the stone. And anyway, so the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of the heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the city and that which grew on the ground. And so brimstone is sulfur, and it came flying down burning. And near Masada, all these kind of white deposits, you see the rest of it all looks kind of a different color of brown, but the foreground is some of that too, but the white deposits are some areas they think may be ash from the time of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's said to be calcium sulfate, which would be a combination of limestone and sulfur ash burned together. And when I was there in 2011 with the archaeology bunch, our leader took us out into this area. And we went out at 8 o'clock in the morning, and all the lighter colored ground is dry, but amazingly at the Dead Sea, 1,200 feet below sea level, they have dew. And so all this stuff here is wet ground and it's dew. And when you walk across the wet stuff, it picks up on your feet like gumbo. And next thing you know, you look like Bigfoot. So this is what the stuff looks like. I took a picture of a dog track that had gone across it. It was a lonely little track. And that's what it looks like. And then you go over to the kind of the sheer walls of the areas, the cliffs or whatever you'd call them, sides of the gullies or whatever they are. And you see impregnated in the sedimentary, or well, I won't call it sedimentary layer, the striated layers of this ash, you see these balls of sulfur, and they're embedded right into the stuff. Now that's a little marble on a keychain to give you an idea of that one. It's just a little tiny sulfur ball. Now, when you're driving up to the Masada Visitor Center, where we get on the tram and go up to the mountaintop, as you pass by, you look to the right, and not far from that visitor center are these strange-looking objects. Some folks think that is a pyramid and that is a sphinx. A lot of the pagan cities had sphinxes and pyramids, ziggurats they called them. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's odd-looking formations. And then all the rest of this stuff, some places they say you can almost see streets and right-angle corners and things. Maybe, maybe not, but it's definitely this. It's all this stuff that it's fairly solid, but you can punch your fist into it. Some say to your elbow if you hit it hard, and it just crumbles into a talc-like substance. So this is a slab of it that's got all kinds of little pock marks where it looks like hail, sulfur has hailed down on it. And this is some of the things you're looking at there. These things are encrusted in a case of crust, and this one's been cracked open like an egg, so the center part is 98, 99% pure sulfur, some kind of amazingly pure sulfur. And our leader there said that he had investigated that, said there was no place else on earth that sulfur was found like that. You find it in different deposits in different ways, but not as pure little balls in that kind of stuff. So anyway, you look across the way and there's the Moab Mountains. That was Lot's home after the destruction of Sodom. That's where his daughters and he and their offspring moved to and lived. Moab was one of the sons of one of Lot's daughters, and Ammon or Ammon was the other, and that brings to mind Ammon, Jordan. So the area of Moab and Ammon were straight across the Dead Sea. A little farther south was the land of Edom, which was the descendants of Esau. And imagine in that day, as all that destruction and fire and those people, Lot and his daughters came out of there, they probably thought they were the only ones left in the world. And the daughters decided that they took it upon themselves, I guess, and tricked their dad into impregnating each of them. And they probably thought they were doing the right thing by repopulating the earth. But anyway, I think, let's see, the next place we come to is Masada. It's about 8:20. Should I wind it up here or go any further, Greg? Okay. Masada is a World Heritage Site. This is a model of the plateau mountain that it's this Herod's palace and fortress was built on. This is a model of the fortress itself. There were 960 Jews after 70 AD when the Romans had finally had it with the Jews and their rebellion, and they went in and totally destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the Temple Mount. The rebels that held out till the bitter end, there were 960 of them, went up on this mountain. And the Romans were going to make an example out of them. They weren't going to let any of them live. They were going to conquer the last of them. So they put 15,000 people around the base of this mountain to lay siege to destroy the 960. Up on the top of that mountain, this some of the artifacts that were found. Significant are these stone cups with the two handles. In the New Testament, when you read that Jesus was approached by the Jews and said, why don't your disciples wash their hands? I don't know if you guys, any of you remember that, but what was the deal? Did they have dirty fingernails? Were they, grubby? It wasn't a hygiene thing. The Jews have a law, a tradition that, it's a law, that you must, the Orthodox do, that you must ritually wash your hands to be pure and clean to eat. So what you do is you take the two-handle cup, you grab one handle, and you pour water over the other hand, and you say, "Blessed be the name of the Lord who gives us the commandment of the washing of the hands," I think it is. And then you grab the other handle so you don't contaminate this hand with the dirt from this one. Pour it over and you say, "Baruch atah Adonai," who gives us, and do that same prayer 3 times in repetition. Once you've done it 3 times, you've washed your hands and you're ritually clean to eat. And so that's what they were talking about when they asked Jesus why his disciples didn't wash their hands. Anyway, you go up this was a snake path. I think, was it Deb? Deb walked up this thing, and Greg went part way. It was a killer, wasn't it?
I think it was Sue and Monique and me and Josh and the young guys did. And Greg would have made it all the way up, except he went back down.
Right, somebody got overheated or something.
And it was about 90 degrees.
It was hot.
Oh, is that all? Later in the day, it gets up over 100 out there. Anyway, they call that the snake path, and that is a footpath to the top of Masada. When you get up there, we took the tram. It was way easier. And so you get up there and you look down and you see these things like this white stuff, that ash I was talking about. This is one of the Roman encampments. There's another. All the way around this mountain there were Roman encampments, and they built huge walls around their base camps, and they also built a huge wall all the way around the mountain as a siege wall, like somebody's going to slip out and get away, And so this was a siege that went on for months. I can't remember exactly. I want to say 7 months, but I think that's an extremely short period of time. Okay, up on the mountain is Herod's palace, and it was amazing. This is some of the plaster that was decorated to look like tiles and that thing in the stone walls there. Anytime you see raw stone in these places, that's like the stud walls. That's like the core of the walls. The walls were finished in beautiful plaster and murals and those kind of things. We come through the kind of an entry gate there and come up and start walking through the place. This is a line that shows the reconstruction line. Anything above this was rebuilt for demonstration purposes. Below that was all in situ, they call it, the stuff that was in place where they found it when they dug it out. And this is some of the storerooms Herod had full of grain. People could last for years up here. There was so much food and water. And that gives you an idea of what the size of those things were with people up above them. Looking out toward the Dead Sea, this is looking north, more Roman encampments around there. and they had mikveh pools up there. Herod had a luxurious sauna set up, just like the baths down in Bet Shean and different places, but they had fires they lit underneath. The heated air would come up under the floor and heat the floors. These tiles had holes in them. I don't have a better picture of that, but they had holes so the heat would travel through the walls and everything was heated. It was quite a luxurious thing. In one place, we come to a location that was the discovery of the lots. There were 960 people up there, families mostly, some soldiers or, Israeli fighters and things. But anyway, the Romans built a siege ramp, 400 feet in the air, and I'll show you here in a second, it was huge, it was enormous. And they also built a siege engine, which was a huge tower that had iron plates on the outside of it and was probably made of stuff like railroad planks. And they pushed this thing up this ramp, 400 feet. It had a battering ram built into it. It had an upper part for shooting arrows down on people and a lower part with a canopy out over it to protect the people who were pushing the thing up the mountain. It just astounds me how these things were done and what people could do in those days. They were all supermen in physical capabilities. Anyway, in this area was found 10 sherds of pottery, each with a name on it. The report is that the day before the Romans were undoubtedly going to break into the place of Masada, into the fortress, that people decided rather than allow their children and loved ones to be tortured and all the hideous things you can imagine women and children could have done to them from soldiers like that. They decided that they would all commit suicide. So each man, in ritual fashion, I think of the way the temple sacrifices were done, each man killed his own family, and then other guys would take turns and they would all kill each other. And it got down to 10 men, and they drew lots on the 10 men, and the last guy to draw the last lot had to kill the other 9 and then commit suicide. And this is evidence of that. It's a horrendous thing. And that is considered to be the death of the country of Israel. For 2,000 years then, this was about 70 or 40 years after the time of Christ's resurrection, it was the death of the land of Israel and the land and the Jewish culture and the whole thing, and they were scattered to the nations after that. And so anyway, another feature, the Roman soldiers had to go something like 8 or 9 miles just to get water. How much water it'd take to water 15,000 people to build their ramp and all that stuff is crazy, but this was the path that they went on to go up probably to Ein Gedi or somewhere up in there to get water. Well, the people on top of the mountain had cisterns full of water. They were happy about that. They raised doves in that area for sacrifice and also food, I think. And we're walking around here on the top of the thing, and this is some of the mikvahs. Mikvahs, they're basically ritual immersion pools. The Jews have them in their worship and cleanliness. You have to be clean to go to the temple. You have to, all these different things, and those were called mikvah pools, and you would mikvah, you would immerse. When you immersed, you would spread your fingers out, do everything you could to have the living water in the baptismal pool, the mikvah pool, touch every part of you. They often even had somebody come in as an observer to make sure their hair didn't float up and not get all their hair even wet. It was amazing the effort they go into. But anyway, this mikvah pools, some of the plaster and that kind of thing. And this was a water system that Herod had built in. It had tons of tunnels, and they brought water, caught all the rainwater on the top, as well as had a couple outside sources that would flow in and fill all these cisterns. And let's see, and that's a model of their water system. Okay, this is on the model, the siege ramp. The siege ramp, I'm not sure if it was 7 months, but I think they said it was 7 months. That's 400 foot in the air, and they piled up dirt, and however they did it, ox carts, baskets, buckets, I don't know, they had slaves as well as soldiers, but they did a tremendous amount of dirt piling there. This is a view of that ramp from the top of Masada looking down the rib of that ramp. These are people, to give you an idea of perspective. It still astounds me. Okay, at the top of that ramp was a breaching point where they broke into the walls of Masada. And this was a placard there with a picture of what they envisioned the siege ramp. Metal sides on it, big metal plates on the outside, iron, and these protective canopies and a battering ram and a place to shoot arrows and all that kind of thing. And I can't imagine how many people it would have taken to push something like that up a hill. Talk about football practice. So this is some of the Roman mini balls and cannonballs from their catapults and that kind of thing. One of the most significant things and spiritual things of the place is this synagogue. The Jews up there had one room that was either converted or had maybe even been a synagogue all along, but it was the synagogue that was found on top of the mountain in the fortress there. And in one corner of that synagogue, in the ruins of it, as they dug after in the 50s or whenever it was, when they started digging back into that area, was Ezekiel 30, a scroll fragment with Ezekiel 32, 4 and 5 on it. Again, he said to me, prophesy to these bones and say to them, O you dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God unto these bones, behold, I will cause breath to enter in you, and you shall live. At the place where Israel died 2,000 years ago, it is believed that God left this sign for them when they revived as a nation to show that their bones were coming back together, the flesh was coming on them. And Messianic believers would tell you that that's what they have today, and they're just waiting for the day that the Holy Spirit, the breath, the Ruach, the breath of God comes back into them, and they are at that time saying, blessed be he who comes in the name of the Lord, and recognize he who they have pierced as being their Messiah, Jesus, Yeshua HaMashiach. And today we see the restoration happening every day in every way. This area also is a place where it was obviously a hallowed military point, and today the young soldiers have, I don't know what you call it, military graduations. They come out of boot camp and out of the special forces training and that, and have their induction ceremonies at the top. I think there's where we'll end for the night. It's about 8:35. Anybody have any questions or anything?